Welcome to What's the Scenario with PLRB, where we explore claims and coverage scenarios relevant to insurance professionals. I'm Alissha Watley.
I'm Tim Havler.
And I'm Mike Broad.
All right, guys. So, what's the scenario today?
Okay, today the scenario is we have a sudden outbreak of Ebola within the United States.
What is this, 2014?
This is a hypothetical, of course. And several patients wind up in the hospital. They are in intensive care. They're in the emergency room for a fair amount of time. Fortunately, all patients survive and are discharged, but the hospital now has to shut down the emergency room, the ICU, and all adjacent areas for 2 weeks because they need to get professional cleaners with biohazard suits to get in there, and they need to really make sure that every last corner of all of those areas is clean because Ebola is such a health risk that we can't, we have to be absolutely sure. So the 2 weeks is necessary here. But the hospital is a business, and for a hospital to be shut down for 2 weeks means they're going to lose income for 2 weeks. So this hospital files a claim for loss of business income with their property insurer. The adjuster gets this claim on their desk and they think, have I ever dealt with anything like this before? So they're wondering if there is going to be coverage on this commercial policy. Now, 5 years ago, we really wouldn't have had any analogies, not a whole lot of laws, and it would have been very difficult for that adjuster and any attorneys who would have been trying to determine whether there's coverage for that loss. Now, here we are post-COVID, 5 years later, or 3 years, 3.5 years since COVID started. I think it's
forever ago?
Yeah, who knows?
Yes. Are we in what it feels like or what it's been?
I know, right?
So now we have, because of all the COVID litigation, we have some court decisions and we have a little bit more case law that's going to give us some guidance on what to do with something like this, where a virus is potentially in a building or on the surface of a building and poses a health risk.
Awesome.
So, Tim, help me out from an adjusting standpoint. All right. So I'm the adjuster getting this claim, want to step through coverage. So I need to get my policies in front of me. But what's one of the first things you think we should look at? Like usually on some kind of a business policy, there has to be some kind of physical damage, some kind of peril that's occurred that's caused the damage. So is that what you would suggest maybe adjusters start to look at first thing?
That's always my question number one. Every time I get a property claim, it's at least on the back of my mind. Almost all property coverages will only cover a direct physical loss to the property. So you got a fire, there's no question. You get wind damage, there's no question. These are physical. But when you have this tiny microscopic little virus that's floating around the air, it comes and goes, it probably doesn't survive that long anyway. You can clean it with bleach. It's not harming the walls or the floors or anything. Just wait a certain amount of time and everything will die on its own. So is that a physical loss to the property? Mike, you're correct. That is the first question
Ding, 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 ding.
we need to be asking. And Mike, before we go any farther in the coverage, I had a question for you and Alissha.
No.
So the start of the pandemic, I think we all remember that time. Weren't we going to have a claims conference right at the start of the pandemic?
Yes, actually we were. So March of 2020, we were actually even before March, about a week before the actual start of the conference of 2020, we started getting all these calls about, are you still having a conference? I've been told I can't go to this conference. And I'm like, all right, that's, you heard about this thing that didn't really have a name, but kind of had a name. And then all of a sudden, we're in DC. We are at the property. We were at the property getting ready to open up registration that Sunday. And what happens? On the news, national news, we find out that someone tested positive for coronavirus a week before we were there. And because there were so many unknowns, the decision was made of, do we move forward? Do we not? And when I tell you, it was like a little war room trying to figure out what to do. Ultimately, we got to the point of, we need to cancel this conference because of all the unknowns of what coronavirus could do, where it was, where this person was. And so that was the start of my 2 weeks working from home 3 years later.
Yeah. And it was interesting, Tim, because at that time, didn't know if this thing's airborne, if it's on surfaces, what could happen, nor long-term implications. So all we knew is that there was a lot of people that were concerned about it. So yeah, we made what I think was the right call to cancel the event and sent out alerts to everybody that we were canceling. But it was interesting that it was in the timing of everything. Our conference would have went through a Wednesday. Well, that Thursday was when the government made the declaration that shutting down all travel. Yeah, everybody's staying at home 30 days to slow the spread or whatever it was way back when. So yeah, it was just interesting from our timing perspective that we were truly right there on the leading edge of what soon became COVID-19, the pandemic.
Yes.
And was that the first conference that we ever had to cancel?
For the claims conference, I'm not aware of. We've had other cancellations due to weather, but for something as serious as this, which was not localized to a particular area, but nationwide, I believe this was the first of its kind to where we had to cancel.
Yeah, especially once everything was all set. I think the ones with weather events, we knew beforehand that we were going to cancel and postpone and move it. But this one, yeah, we were truly on site, ready to go, and had to shut it down.
Yeah, I have March 11th written down as the day the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. But in my mind, it's always the next day, March 12th. That's when it got reported that Tom Hanks was diagnosed with coronavirus. In my mind, that's the day. That's the day when everyone knew this is going to be a big deal.
That makes perfect sense.
Yep.
So yeah, the rest is history. We all learned social distancing entered our vocabulary. And how long were we cooped up that whole first summer with the shutdowns? I think it was the whole first year.
I believe so. We had one brave person who made it to the office every day, but that's because she lived 5 minutes away. But for the most part, it was everyone stay home. And if you had to go into the office, you took all these measures, or you had to do the survey to go in and take your temperature twice a day and record that and share that with HR. So yeah, 2020 was a year, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so tying this back to insurance, that whole time, a lot of businesses were having to close their doors. It was either they had to, or they just weren't getting any customers. So they had to let go employees and, close their doors. So this was the leisure, food and drink sector, mostly. If you're a business person, you'd probably call it that. And, a lot of these businesses, they knew they had business income coverage. So they filed a claim with their insurance companies, and now the insurers had a totally novel situation on their hands. We can think of before we had Zika or SARS or swine flu, and none of these were even close to what COVID ended up being. So now the insurers are having to deal with a situation that could potentially be huge covered losses if it ended up being covered.
True. So, COVID was a brand new issue back in like 2020. And how did insurance companies categorize it to start?
Well, I think right from the beginning, they recognized, like Mike said before, that this doesn't seem like it's a physical loss. So a lot of them planted their flag right there and said there's no coverage for any of these COVID business shutdown claims.
Mhm.
And some companies actually saw that their policies had a specific exclusion for viruses.
Hmm.
And those companies, they had an easy time because that exclusion was inserted into the policy way back after SARS, when ISO looked at SARS and said, okay, this could potentially be a problem going forward, so maybe we should just exclude viruses from these policies. But it wasn't in all policies. So companies that didn't have the virus exclusion, they
Mhm.
were looking more at calling this not a physical loss.
Gotcha.
And what do you think, Tim, from the other perspective, if I was coming to try to find coverage for loss, what were the arguments on the other side that there should be some coverage here?
Sure. The big one is that you don't necessarily need destruction to your property for something to be a quote unquote physical loss.
Mhm.
Sometimes even just the fact that you can't use your property as it was intended, some courts would say even that's enough. And then you can make an analogy to things like mold, that's a direct physical loss. You could make an analogy to smoke, that's a direct physical loss. So
Mhm.
these are, these little tiny things. Now, mold and smoke probably actually affect your property more than a virus does, but they're not bad analogies to make. And that's primarily what the policyholders were arguing.
So have any of these cases, have they worked their ways through the court system, Tim? Do we have some decisions on COVID and business income losses?
Mhm.
They have, like we said, it's been 3.5 years, and you might be
Mhm.
thinking, well, all the cases should have worked their way through the courts by now.
Yeah.
No, no,
Nope.
no. Litigation is a slow process, but we do have a bunch of decisions, and by far the majority approach by the courts has been to say that this is not a direct physical loss. So most policyholders have been told by the judge that they don't have coverage for their claims. We have pretty solid decisions from New York, Illinois, Indiana, Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, and others. Two states that went the other way, Vermont and California.
Hmm.
Judges in these states have said it could be a direct physical loss, but they've also said we're going to have to do some more. We want more science. We want maybe an expert to tell us, yes, this really did pose a health risk inside that building. So they're kind of focused on the health risk and they want more proof about it.
There would probably have to be some proof that that physical location actually had some sort of a viral infection then, correct? Would you think?
I think that would be a bare minimum.
Yeah.
And then even past that, to say that it really posed a risk to someone in that building is maybe even another step past that. And what kind of expert you retain to testify that is another challenge, because I don't know who could say that or what methods they would use to prove it. It's possible, but it's a challenge.
Yeah.
Okay. And question, do you think some of the decisions had something to do with how businesses reacted to the pandemic? So you had some states that were, wide open, it didn't exist and they were doing business as usual, and other states that were a little more cautious.
So from the insurance coverage perspective, I would say that was not relevant to the outcome of any of these cases. Yes, you're right. Some states well, as you know, this has become a political flashpoint, but we don't need to get into any of that. But some states were more, they had more of a tendency to have a blanket shutdown on everything, where some kind of let some more activities happen. But again, from the insurance perspective, it's direct physical loss, it's virus exclusion.
Gotcha. So there were quite a few like businesses that, were able to stay open. What happened to the businesses that had to close during the pandemic?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably some of them we were able to survive. Probably some didn't quite make it. Maybe some took the PPP loans and made it. Maybe some had to lay off some employees. Maybe some then hired the employees back. It's been a tough time for all businesses through this, and they just did their best they could through it all.
Mhm.
And it's funny if you look at it, that businesses that say pivoted and started to do more delivery or set up the tents outside where folks could eat, those sorts of things. I think at it from an adjusting standpoint, if somebody truly did have a covered business income loss, how all that would factor into, geez, didn't have the business that we used to have because you had to keep the tables separated, or we were out in these tents, or we went to delivery versus having people in house, but that also might have affected the expenses that the business had as well. So from a adjusting standpoint,
Right. So
you're right, yeah, you would really need an expert to help you figure out from an accounting standpoint, what did you truly lose here? A business could have even, in some instances, maybe business improved with the new delivery options and less expenses. It would be a real thing to challenge to kind of work through, is it from an adjusting standpoint?
right, because like you said, there were opportunities to mitigate this. Remember, a lot of restaurants just started setting up tables outside, which over the summer, even in the northern states, they could do that.
But let's think maybe looking at it again from the perspective of our original scenario and in the future here. So what do you think folks should look for, Tim? The case law seems to be that you need some sort of a direct physical kind of loss to get coverage. So when it comes to future possible, hopefully not pandemics, but any kind of a viral kind of claim that might pop up on an adjuster's desks, what kind of things should we look for?
Sure. So we can go back to our Ebola claim here. That adjuster in the vast majority of states is going to be able to assert a pretty good argument that that's not a direct physical loss in the building to the hospital. Now, could you try to argue that, well, Ebola is more dangerous than COVID once it infects a person? You could make that argument based on the court opinions I've read. I doubt the judges who said there wasn't a direct physical loss, I doubt they would be convinced by that differentiation. They seem to be saying if it doesn't really harm the actual property inside the building, it's not going to be enough. And then, like I said before, too, in addition to that, you always need to read down the exclusions in your policy. And if you see that virus exclusion, then you're in very good shape.
Right. And from an adjusting standpoint, that might even be some sort of an endorsement tied onto your policy. So make sure just not the actual policy form itself, but any endorsements that might apply. Look for those potential exclusions, because a lot were added by endorsement, I believe, after these events occurred.
Yes, I'm sure the underwriting departments have changed things quite a bit since then.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So let's do a recap. What was the scenario again?
Okay, we had an Ebola outbreak in the United States. Several patients wound up in the hospital. The patients survived, but the hospital had to shut down for 2 weeks to adequately clean all of those areas. The hospital submitted a claim for business income for 2 weeks of income loss, and the insurance company has looked at their policy. The adjuster has gone through that policy in detail. And in most states, they're probably going to deny this either on the virus exclusion if they had it, or to say that based on the law in this state that came down against direct physical loss, the argument is there is no physical loss.
Perfect. And before Alissha concludes with her patented closing remarks, one plug for Tim there. So Tim, as a novice adjuster just starting out in the business, say that I had this come across my desk. I think I know the coverage, how it might play out, but I really have some questions of what the court might rule on our policy language. Could somebody in my shoes reach out to PLRB and a coverage attorney like yourself and run the scenario by them to maybe get some thoughts and opinions as to what direction I should lead in my claims investigation?
Yes, Mike. PLRB members at any time they want can go to our website, plrb.org, and click on the big Ask a Coverage Question button. And your coverage will be automatically assigned to an attorney on staff here. I'm one of those attorneys. We do coverage every single day. We're always thinking about these issues. We love talking about it. We love looking into it for you. We love working with the adjusters. So again, anytime, feel free to submit one of those questions to us.
I can't wait.
All right. Well, Tim and Mike, thank you so much for joining us here on What's the Scenario with PLRB. And I hope to hear from you guys very soon.
Yay, until next time.
All right.
See
Thanks.
ya.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in this resource are those of the individual speaker and not necessarily those of the Property and Liability Resource Bureau, its membership, or any organization with which the presenter is employed or affiliated. The information, ideas, and opinions are presented as information only and not as legal advice or offers of representation. Individual policy language and state laws vary, and listeners should rely on guidance from their companies and counsel as appropriate.